They had nothing at all to say to one another, and that was as far as Jack Cromwell had come before the enormous brick wall that served as writer block struck him hard. Now, he was sitting at his desk, staring at the computer screen with a furrowed brow, as though he was trying to will the finished story into existence. Of course, he was unsuccessful in that endeavor, so he got up and stretched, squirming at the snapping and popping noises made by his cramped vertebrae. He wondered, almost immediately wishing he hadn't, remembering his ex-girlfriend Amy. One of Amy's less annoying habits was to enjoy the sound her bones made when she popped them. Jack returned his attention to the screen after shaking his head. The incomplete story was still there, taunting him with its void. Jack sighed again and got up. He paced across his sparsely furnished living room and into the darkened kitchen. He flipped the light switch and briefly basked in the fluorescent light. Even though it stung his red-rimmed eyes, he went to the nearest cabinet and brought out a bag of brown sugar. He opened it up and was just about to dig in when a spectacular gust of wind whistled through the old house, setting his teeth on edge. Then the Arctic October chill hit him and he shivered. Damn this place, he thought darkly as he walked to the nearest window, which was open. Why did I ever let my agent talk me into coming to this cesspit? Said cesspit was a small cottage located just outside of a town that was so small it hadn't even registered on his GPS. The cottage was old and squat, a hutch of wood and weathered stone that far exceeded the usual standards of rustic hell. The only signs of any modern influences were a crooked antenna and a small generator that hugs the cottage's left side. The generator was big enough to provide light and phone reception, but anything else was stretching it. He had to get an extra one just to be able to run his laptop and the mini fridge that he brought with him from his apartment. His agent had told him in her own roundabout way that the place would be perfect in getting the old creative juices running. Jack assumed that she was referring to the location's rich and fascinating past, or the fact that it had been visited by other writers. He now understood that his agent had picked this location for him because the damn place was unquestionably the creepiest place he had ever seen, and the unease there wasn't caused by the wind's constant moaning or the numerous dark crevices. Though the creaking rafterboards did add to the overall atmosphere, he believed it was the perfect location for a horror novel because it was right in the middle of a huge clearing full of tall reeds and surrounded on all sides by ancient trees that had lost their leaves but still seemed to harbor a sea of shadows. Jack sighed as he approached the window and shut it, fastening it. He wondered, feeling cold, if I had left it open. Naturally, I slithered up his spine. He shook his head to dispel the fictitious ghosts and peered out over the clearing, where the reeds were bending in the cool breeze, seemingly bound to one another. The full moon hung in the tar-black sky, its eerie lights revealing their pale green coloration. The moonlight also caused the shadows of the nearby forest to creep outwards like an army moving toward his small cottage. An army of shadows, huh? That's a really nice idea. Jack winced at the thought, then smiled. After barely 3 steps to his desk, he felt the beginnings of a story begin to take shape. The breeze hit his bare neck, and he let out a muffled yell before turning back to see the window open once more. Jack stood motionless, with a sense of dread rising inside of him. He took one stumbling step toward the window, then another, and he was at the casement. I know I locked the window latch because the wind couldn't have been that strong. Jack reached out and closed the window once more, this time latching it and pressing down to make sure it was stuck. He then turned around and he went to his desk and stared at the screen, trying to release his fear onto the printed word. When he was unable to do so, he sighed and turned to return to the kitchen. When he reached the counter, he stopped and stared, noticing that the bag of brown sugar had been split open, spilling the sugar all over the counter. Jack approached and raised the bag to reveal multiple long cuts in the plastic. He then looked down and noticed multiple sets of tiny tracks in the sugar, indicating that there was an animal in the house. He couldn't help but shudder at the idea of a rat or raccoon in his cottage, as he hadn't been around animals since he was 10 years old, when he was attacked by a feral dog. "I have to go call animal control," he thought, turning and letting out a stand-on, but the window was open once more. Fear has a way of enhancing the senses, so as he approached, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. What the heck was he saying? It's the reason why so many people experience negative emotions before a disaster, why many survivors of animal attacks can remember feeling predatory eyes watching them from the dark, and how one can sense a presence with them when none can be seen. Now that fear had heightened Jack's senses to their utmost, he could see the dust motes hanging in the air like snowflakes suspended in mid-fall, smell the old wood and the cracked vinyl of the couch that sat near his desk, hear every little creak and groan that the old cot made, and taste the remnants of his breakfast that clung to his teeth. He stepped up to the window and noted with no small amount of irrational fear that the wind had stopped. He reached up and slowly closed the window again, wincing as his overly sensitive fingers scraped the rough wood of the frame, clicked the latch shut, and then began to turn. When he saw the curtain move, he stopped and felt his chest tighten. He looked into the hazy darkness behind the silk curtain and saw something moving slowly upwards. It was large and nearly as black as the shadows in which it crawled. It looked like a tarantula, but most arachnids only had 8 legs, but this one had much more. Each leg was long, pencil thin, and had far too many joints, and on top of each leg was what appeared to be a talon of some sort. Although Jack couldn't see the spider thing's eyes, it must have them because it seemed to be watching him. The spider thing leaped from its spot on the wall and landed in the shadows on the far left side of the room with startling speed. Jack yelled in astonishment and jumped back. He spun around to see that the spider thing had disappeared into the darkness. Searching for a light source, he grabbed a nearby lamp with trembling hands and turned it on, feeling ecstatic to see the yellow light and hear the click. Around him, a halo of light flares up. There were too many items in the room for it to conceal, so Jack peered around the room, daring only to take a few steps in either direction. He heard a scuttling movement to his far left, and he turned just in time to see the thing's hazy outline. "I need to call someone," he thought, darting inside his kitchen. "I've never seen a spider this fast. What if it's poisonous? What about those tracks?" he worried. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and Jack halted, waiting with bated breath to see if the noise would cause the unknown creature to react. He didn't have to wait long, because the spider thing appeared from around the corner of the doorway, its spindly legs moving quickly and creating a scratching sound that made his teeth tense. To his horror, it was joined by a second one that was bigger than its partner. He turned his attention back to the kitchen, feeling the sweat running down his back, making him even more vulnerable to the cold air. As Jack concentrated on those long legs and the loud clicking that signaled their passing, his chest constricted. His gaze briefly strayed from them as he frantically roamed the empty room looking for some sort of weapon, but he couldn't find anything, and his throat tightened with panic. Jack returned his focus to the 2 creatures, and as one of them suddenly scampered off to one side and sprang at him, he crossed his arms over his face to block the incoming blow, which caused the monster to land on his forearm. The body had the smoothness of polished marble and the coldness of ice. Jack let out a cry of terror and agony as the arachnoid monster's talons must be barbed like fish hooks because talent sunk into the soft skin of his arm and he shook it wildly in an attempt to get rid of the thing, but every time he jolted, pain flashed up his arm. With tears in his eyes, he thought, "No matter how hard I shake, I won't be able to get it off." Then, a second pair of talons grabbed his leg, and he fell forward, applying as much pressure as he could. The spider thing squealed like a pig as its disgusting body was crushed. and he kept his leg on it until he felt its cold blood seep into his parent leg. Jack then lurched to the side and fell on his arm in the hopes of condemning the creature to the same fate as its brother, but the spider thing buried up his arm and onto his shoulder the moment its talons left their position, and the blood started to flow. The thing crept up to Jack's face, latching onto his neck as it did, and raised its front legs at him, giving him a terrifyingly close-up look at a mouth lined with flat white teeth that snapped together with an audible crack. Jack realized that the talons had torn out a fair chunk of flesh. Jack screamed in terror and frantically shook his head, but the creature would not be dislodged, digging its talons into his nape until he felt them strike bone. The pain was so great that he jumped to his feet and lowered his head, charging at the closest wall like a furious bull. The spider thing wasn't quick enough this time, and Jack slumped to the floor, dazed and wounded, feeling the rancid-smelling liquids moisten his hair and trickle down his forehead. He took deep breaths in a desperate attempt to slow his heart rate, but the terrible stench and the overall horror of the ordeal prevented him from calming down. With great effort, Jack regained his balance and took hesitant, jerky steps to the door. "I need fresh air," he thought, "because this stuff smells like rotten meat." He opened the door and stumbled outside, where the cool wind felt pleasant against his skin. Jack felt his muscles gradually relax as the breeze carried the pleasant smell of grass and earth. His breathing, which had been hard and rapid, was now steadily relaxing. "I should phone someone," I thought. "I've never seen spiders like that, so I can't take any chances." Jack felt his wits slowly returning. That creature's might have been toxic. As Jack's back began to hurt, he stood himself, squirmed, and tried to collect himself before going back inside to phone someone outside the stars. Gleaming under a black veil like diamonds as Jack looked for his phone, the reeds started to shake and bend as dark shapes pushed them aside. The wind started to pick up again, its low moaning masking the soft sounds of the approaching swarm. The clearing around the cottage was quiet and still, and every animal, from the tiniest field mouse to the largest snake, stayed in their homes on this night, as they had learned to do over the centuries through death, blood, and the loss of their offspring. The shadows were alive tonight, infested by a horde creatures that had crept up from the deep dark places where they nested, hungry and crafty,